Before a drug can be tested on people, it has to survive a tough screening process that most drugs don't make it through. First, scientists do basic research. They find a target in the body, like a protein or an enzyme, that's involved in a disease. Then they test thousands, sometimes millions of chemicals to see which ones affect that target in a helpful way. This step alone can take 2 to 3 years, and by the end, only a small number of chemicals are still in the running. The chemicals that make it through this step move on to preclinical testing. This means lab experiments and animal studies to see how the compound acts inside a living body. How does it travel through the body? Where does it build up? What doses are too dangerous? What side effects show up? By this point, the company has usually spent around $500 million. If preclinical testing goes well, the company asks the government for permission to test the drug on people. In the US, that's the FDA. This request is called an investigational new drug application. The FDA has 30 days to respond. If they don't say no, human trials can start. What follows is a 3-phase process that is, collectively, the most expensive and time-consuming part of the entire journey. Phase 1 uses a small group of healthy people, usually 20 to 80, who take the drug so doctors can check if it's safe, find the right dose, and see how it moves through the body. Healthy people go first because it's not yet about testing if the drug works. It's about testing if the body can handle it. Using healthy volunteers gives a clean read on the drug's effects, without a disease in the picture to confuse things, and it's far safer than it sounds. By the time a drug reaches a person, it's already been tested in animals to find a safe dose range. Human trials start with a dose much lower than that, given to just a few people at a time in a clinical facility with doctors watching closely. The dose only goes up slowly. Serious harm is rare. Most side effects are mild, like a headache. This phase takes about 2.3 years on average. Phase 2 grows to a few hundred patients who actually have the disease. This checks whether the drug works and keeps checking safety. This is where real patients come in for the first time, because now the question isn't only about if it's safe, but also about if it actually helps. That can only be answered by giving it to people who have the condition. Everyone in the trial gives informed consent. They're told up front it's experimental and told the possible risks. Many Phase 2 trials also use a control group. Some patients get the new drug, others get a fake treatment, like a sugar pill with no real medicine in it called a placebo or the current standard treatment. This helps the doctors tell if the drug is actually doing something, or if patients would have improved anyway. For serious diseases where withholding treatment would be harmful, patients are typically compared against the existing standard treatment, not a placebo. If a side effect shows up, doctors can stop the drug right away, and in most cases, once the drug is out of the body, the side effect fades along with it. That said, it isn't guaranteed for every side effect. A small number can cause lasting harm even after the drug is stopped, which is exactly why the trial keeps monitoring patients closely and has an independent safety board that can pull the plug on the whole study early if something serious turns up. Safety checks from Phase 1 also continue here, with more people taking it for longer. Side effects that were too rare to show up before sometimes appear now. This phase takes about 3.6 years on average. Phase 3 is the final and biggest step. Now the drug is tested on thousands of patients, often in many different countries. This stage proves whether the drug truly works, compares it to treatments that already exist, and catches rare side effects that smaller trials with fewer people could easily miss. It takes about 3.3 more years. At every phase, most drugs get dropped along the way. Out of all the drugs that start clinical trials, only about 10 to 12% ever make it to approval. But all that care and time costs a lot of money, and that cost is part of why approved drugs end up priced the way they are. When a drug company starts developing a new drug, it usually files for a patent very early, often before testing on animals is even finished. A patent gives the company 20 years when no one else can copy the drug. But there's a catch. Clinical trials eat up most of that 20-year clock. By the time the drug actually gets approved and hits the market, the company usually has only 7 to 12 years of patent protection left. During those years, the company is the only one allowed to sell that drug. No cheaper copycat version is allowed to compete, and there's no real limit on price except what buyers, governments, insurance companies, patients are willing to pay. High prices during this window are needed to make back the huge cost of research, including all the drugs that failed and never made it to market. If a company spends $2.6 billion and only 1 in 10 drugs succeeds, the one that succeeds has to earn enough to cover the other 9 that didn't. Only when the patent runs out, generic versions can now enter the market, and at that point, competition usually drops prices by 80 to 90% within a year. This sudden loss of revenue is known in the industry as the patent cliff. To delay that cliff, companies use a few tricks. One is evergreening, making small tweaks to a drug just to qualify for a brand new patent. Another is pay for delay, where the brand name company actually pays a generic competitor to stay out of the market a little longer. The manufacturing of drugs at scale is one of the most technically demanding and heavily regulated industrial processes on Earth. Every drug has two components. The active pharmaceutical ingredient, the API, is the chemical compound that actually does the therapeutic work. The excipients are the inactive ingredients, binders, fillers, coatings that hold the pill together, control its release, and make it possible to swallow. The API is almost always the hardest and most expensive part to produce. Synthesizing an API requires a precise sequence of reactions, often involving dozens of steps, at exact temperatures, pressures, and timings, with strict controls on purity at every stage. Given how much can go wrong, it's no surprise regulators treat drug manufacturing as one of the most tightly controlled processes in industry. FDA regulations governing pharmaceutical manufacturing cover everything from the design of clean rooms to the training of personnel to the documentation of every step in every batch. Inspectors conduct unannounced inspections of manufacturing facilities around the world. A failed inspection can result in a facility being barred from supplying the US market, instantly creating a shortage of whatever drugs that facility produces. The FDA analyzed 163 drugs that went into shortage between 2013 and 2017. In 62% of cases, quality problems at manufacturing facilities were the primary cause. This matters enormously because of where that production is concentrated. 50 years ago, the United States manufactured a significant proportion of its own pharmaceutical ingredients. Today, it manufactures almost none. This shift happened gradually, then all at once. Labor costs in Asia are a fraction of Western equivalents. A 2009 World Bank study found that if a typical Western API manufacturer had a wage index of 100, the equivalent Chinese company had an index of 8. Environmental regulations in the West have also raised the cost of chemical manufacturing substantially. Over decades, the economics of global pharmaceutical supply chains pulled almost all API production toward two countries. India and China now dominate global API manufacturing. India holds 48% of all active API drug master file registrations for the US market, the regulatory filings required before an API can be used in a drug sold in America. The US itself holds just 8%, down from 10% in 2021, and represented only 3% of new filings in 2024. For specific drug categories, the concentration is even more acute. Antibiotics are the starkest example. China and India together produce approximately 70% of the world's antibiotic APIs. The US imports more than 80% of its generic API ingredients. For some individual compounds, there may be only one or two facilities in the world capable of producing them at scale. The consequence of this concentration is a supply chain that is highly efficient under normal conditions and catastrophically vulnerable under stress. A single factory fire, a regulatory shutdown, an environmental enforcement action, or a geopolitical disruption can remove the only source of a critical ingredient from the global market. Between 2018 and 2023, 258 unique active ingredients entered national shortages in the United States, representing nearly 2,000 individual drug products. According to the US Pharmacopea's 2025 Annual Drug Shortage Report, 89% of drug shortages in 2024 carried over from the previous year. More than 40 life-saving drugs have been in shortage for over 3 years. The consequences are not abstract: delayed care, medication errors, and measurably elevated patient mortality. Once a drug is manufactured and packaged, it enters a distribution system that operates with the complexity of a major logistics network. In the United States, pharmaceutical distribution is dominated by 3 companies, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health, which together handle roughly 90% of all drug distribution in the country. These distributors operate enormous centralized warehouses and a fleet of temperature-controlled vehicles. Temperature control is non-negotiable for many drugs. Biologics, vaccines, insulin, and a growing category of specialty medications must be maintained within precise temperature ranges throughout the entire journey from factory to patient. A single temperature excursion can render an entire shipment unusable. The final step is the pharmacy, and even that is its own logistics job. A typical pharmacy stocks thousands of different products, and each one has its own rules: when to reorder it, how long it stays good for, and how it needs to be stored. Pharmacists do a lot more than just hand out pills. They're also managing inventory in real time, trying to keep enough of everything in stock. Some of that demand is easy to predict, like medication people take every day for ongoing conditions. But some of it isn't, like a sudden infection or a bad flu season. So pharmacies also have to be ready for the unexpected. Also, between the manufacturer and the patient sit several other entities that influence what the patient ultimately pays. Pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, which negotiate drug prices on behalf of insurers and employers, insurance companies that determine which drugs are covered and at what tier, and government programs like Medicare and Medicaid that set their own reimbursement rates. Every part of this chain has been shaped by one fact: the drug is still under patent. That changes the moment it isn't. When a patent expires and generic manufacturers enter the market, the economics flip almost completely. Generic drugs fill 91% of prescriptions in the United States. They account for only 18% of total drug spending. That gap represents approximately $400 billion in savings to the healthcare system annually, and it is the most important cost control mechanism in pharmaceutical economics. But the generic market has its own structural vulnerabilities. A generic manufacturer must prove to the FDA that their product is bioequivalent to the branded original, that it delivers the same active ingredient at the same rate into the bloodstream. This is called an abbreviated new drug application. The process is faster than a full drug approval, but still requires significant investment in testing, regulatory work, and facility compliance. For a drug with a big market, lots of generic companies compete to make it and prices drop fast. That's a good outcome. But for a cheap, simple generic that only a small number of patients need, the math doesn't work the same way. The profit margin is razor thin. Here's the problem. A company making a $1.50 generic antibiotic has to follow the exact same FDA rules, pass the same facility inspections, and manage the same supply chain risks as a company making a specialty drug that costs $300,000 a year. The cost of following the rules are basically the same, but the money coming in is nowhere close. So when a company can't make enough profit, it simply stops making that drug. And if several companies pull out around the same time, there's nobody left to make it. That's how a shortage happens. A patented drug is expensive because one company has a monopoly and can charge almost anything. A generic drug goes into shortage for the opposite reason. Too much competition, prices too low, margins too thin to keep anyone in the business. Both hurt patients. They're just two different symptoms of the same system. So here's the full picture. Getting a single pill into your hand takes over a decade of research, billions of dollars, and a testing process built to protect you from a drug that doesn't work. Then it has to survive other general part, including the manufacturing, distribution, and pricing, and eventually razor-thin margins just to stay on the shelf at all when the patent runs out and the price finally drops. Put all these together, and you get a system that's expensive on one end, fragile in the middle, and running on thinner margins than most people realize.